And that's what climate change is about. It is literally, not figuratively, a clear and present danger.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction.
The ability of CO2 to do the heavy work of creating a climate catastrophe is almost nil at this point.
The price of oil has been artificially elevated to the point of insanity.
That's not how you power a modern industrial system.
The ultimate goal of this renewable energy, plan is to reach the exact same point that we're at now.
You know who's tried that? Germany. 7 straight days of no wind for Germany. Their factories are shutting down.
They really do act like weather didn't happen prior to 1910.
Today is Friday.
That's right, Greta. It is Friday, and this is the best day of the week, not just because the weekend is almost here, but because this is the day the Heartland Institute broadcasts the Climate Realism Show. My name is Jim Lakely. I'm the Vice President of the Heartland Institute. We're an organization that's been around for 40 years and is known as the leading global think tank pushing back on climate alarmism. Heartland and this show brings you the data, the science, the truth, and when we're fortunate, excellent guests to counter the climate alarmist narrative you've been fed every day of your life. There is nothing else quite like the Climate Realism Show streaming anywhere, so I hope you will bring your friends to view this live stream every Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and also like, share, and subscribe, and leave your comments underneath the video. All of these very easy actions help the YouTube algorithm to smile upon this program and get it in front of even more people. And as a reminder, because big tech and the legacy media does not really approve of the way that we cover climate and energy policy on this program, Heartland's YouTube channel has been demonetized. So if you want to support this program, and I sure hope you do, please visit heartland.org/TCRS. That's heartland.org/TCRS, which stands for the Climate Realism Show. And you can help make sure that we keep this program coming to you every single week. Any support you can give is warmly welcome and greatly appreciated. And I also want to mention, we got a very generous contribution to Heartland just this week because of this show. And I'd love to trumpet his name, but I have not gotten permission to do so. Yet you know who you are. And we want to thank you very much for that. And I'm so glad and humbled that you are a fan of this program and chose to contribute to the Heartland Institute. So thank you. I also want to thank our streaming partners every week, junkscience.com, CFACT, What's Up With That, the CO2 Coalition, and Heartland UK Europe. So welcome to you all. And I hope you will follow all of these X accounts and become a subscriber to this show on YouTube and Rumble by subscribing to the Heartland Institute channel on YouTube and Rumble. Okay. We have a big show today and a very special guest, so let's get rolling. Today we have with us Anthony Watts, Senior Fellow at the Heartland Institute and the publisher of the most influential website on climate in the world, What's Up With That? We have Linnea Lukin. She's a Research Fellow for Energy and Environment Policy at the Heartland Institute, and we are so happy to welcome back to the show once again, Dr. Judith Curry. Dr. Curry is the president and co-owner of Climate Forecast Applications Network, CFAN. In a previous life, she was a professor and the chair of the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at Georgia Institute of Technology. She has testified before Congress on climate matters at least a dozen times. She's been the star of several interviews of influential people in new media, including John Stossel and Jordan Peterson. And Dr. Curry is also the author of many books, the latest of which, from 2023, being Climate Uncertainty and Risk, Rethinking Our Response, which I believe the last time you were on our program, we talked about that book. Oh, and she's also been a speaker at Heartland's International Conference on Climate Change. Dr. Judith Curry, it is such a pleasure to have you back with us and our audience.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's always fun to talk with this group.
Yes, should be a lot of fun in the chat and for all these people watching it live and also watching it after we post it on our channel, auto-archived as we always do. But like I said, we have a lot to cover today. It's been a big news week in climate and energy. And of course, we want to talk about a new paper that Dr. Curry and a colleague had published just this week. It's a pretty good paper, and we will go over that as well. But first, we'll start the show off as we always do with the crazy climate news of the week. Hit it, Andy. Thank you very much, Bill Nye. Safety first, safety first. Good thing you were taking care of that fire there. All right. Our first item today is titled NOAA Die-In. Anthony Watts found this week. This is a Facebook post from the Boulder County Democratic Party. That's about as progressive as it gets, Boulder County, Colorado. And it's described this way, and we'll play the video for you. Boulder hits the ground for workers' rights. On May Day, which I call Commie Christmas, but they call International Workers' Day, protesters staged a die-in at NOAA to symbolize the lives at risk from climate science cuts. With over 1,800 NOAA employees laid off nationwide, the protest highlighted the urgency of protecting federal workers and the essential services they provide. Getting involved with your local party can help turn this protest into policy change. All right, Andy, we got the video of that. It's, well, it is what it is. Why don't you hit that video for us?
Federal workers. Immigrant rights.
Oh boy. Oh boy. All right. Well, I guess that could have gone on and on. 14 seconds is quite long enough. And on a week that we got a new pope, I thought the ringing of the bells and the chimes was a nice touch. Anthony, I want to start with you because you shared this video with us. The Heartland Institute, we haven't had a good die-in at our offices for quite a while, several years now, and I'm starting to feel neglected.
Yeah, it's just amazing what the people get this impression that since NOAA is being trimmed, they're taking out some programs that aren't necessarily useful. For example, the $1 billion weather disaster thing. They're taking that out because it's just government-backed propaganda. It's scaring people. So they're taking out some of these programs, right? And these folks treat this as if the whole weather service is going away. Weather forecasts are going to stop, rain, storms, pestilence are going to come from the sky and destroy us, all this stuff. That's the way they view this. And of course, it's a completely irrational view. And by the way, speaking of irrational, get this. I found that this week. The National Weather Service is putting up their guard. They are ordering all their offices to be on the lookout and enhance their security because a group of nutballs is out to attack the weather radar stations at NOAA. Why? Because there are dangerous death rays in the atmosphere. Seriously. That's what they're saying. They're saying this on Twitter. They're basically heating up the sky and causing all kinds of weather modification and so forth. So the WSR 88D radar, a lifesaver since the early 90s, is now being viewed by left-wing nutballs as some kind of a weapon against the atmosphere, designed to oppress us, and therefore they want to go out and attack these things. That's the kind of irrationalization we are dealing with here on this side of the climate equation.
Yeah, wow. Well, it's funny, Judy, right before we went on the air, went live today, we were talking about, kind of the state of climate coverage in the media or, of climate alarmism. And you had mentioned, and as mentioned here in the setup for that little video, they're out there, hitting the chimes and having a die-in because 1,800 NOAA employees had been, dismissed and that the Trump administration doesn't feel they're very necessary anymore. And you had remarked that, I guess, other than this die-in, it's gotten very little media attention.
Yeah, this whole issue, of climate change and the activism and the alarmism, people are losing interest in it. As far as I can tell, the media coverage on it just isn't there. With regards to NOAA, it's interesting. They're targeting the Office of Atmospheric Research, which funds the cooperative institutes, a number of the research labs, and the university grants program. This is the main thing that's being targeted at NOAA. And you may not realize it, but Boulder has 10 NOAA labs. I couldn't name more than about 2 or 3 of them, so I don't know what most of them even do. But, if NOAA really hits this funding like it looks like they might, I mean, this could really decimate Boulder. A big part of their population and economy is tied to these NOAA labs and the big cooperative institute at University of Colorado. And so all of the, a lot of what goes on in Boulder has been sort of subsidized by these government labs for decades now. So that'd be a big change for that community.
Yeah, it made me think of that song "Allentown" by Billy Joel, but they're closing all the climate alarmism factories down, I guess, in Boulder, Colorado. All right, let's hit our second item today, a little bit more substantive. The polar ice narrative is melting. Now, I want to get into this. Actually, I am going to play this video. We can kind of set this up, I think, a little bit by this video by John Kerry, who said this at the time he was the climate czar during Joe Biden's presidency. I think it's a great example of combining bad science and romantic myth that adds to the apocalyptic narrative, which is kind of our topic today. So go ahead and hit that Kerry video for us, Andy.
The scientist there said to me, "Mr. Secretary, if you really want to understand what's happening with climate change, you have to go to Antarctica." And so I went back to Washington and told my staff, we're going to Antarctica. And indeed, I flew out. I voted by absentee ballot. I flew out on the very election day in the United States. And learning the news I learned, flying over the Pacific, we almost thought we'd stay in the Antarctic. But I decided, obviously, to come back for the fight. But in the Antarctic, it was magical. I mean, I've never seen wilderness like that. There was something eerily grounding in this. And the firsthand impact of climate change that was being described to me by nearly 20 plus scientists from each of 20 plus countries that go there to do research chilled me in terms of, beyond the cold, in terms of what we're facing. I was at ground zero for climate change at McMurdo Station. And as I listened to these scientists from all over the world and looked at chart after chart where they traced what has been happening, describing the latest deeply alarming evidence of what is going on, I was genuinely scared. How do you translate this into a language that the average citizen can understand and connect to? I flew by helicopter over the great West Antarctic ice sheet, which now people say is threatened to perhaps break off or slide down and go off into the ocean to melt. I learned how the warmer water is spilling over the continental shelf and churning below the ice and creating instability in it.
Yeah. So, okay. So even before we get into the data and analysis that we have queued up to rebut that soliloquy by John Kerry, Judy, I want to ask you, what do you think when you hear powerful people with great influence but no scientific training say such things with such confidence?
Well, he's repeating what he was told. I don't doubt that there were some scientists there who were spinning this yarn for him. I mean, what he wanted to hear. This way they get more funding, they get, their names in the newspaper, their university or their institution is happy. So, I don't think John Kerry made this stuff up. I think scientists were feeding it to him. But I think they're scientists who don't pay very much attention to the actual data, or they don't pay much attention to the uncertainties and trying to understand what we don't know about natural climate and geologic variability in that region, which is very substantial.
Yeah, that's true. You definitely heard what he wanted to hear. All right, so let's, Andy, you can pull up this story. This is from the New York Post. This has been covered in other places, but I thought this piece from Roger Pelkey Jr., who I'm sure Dr. Curry is familiar with. We certainly are. He's a brave scientist. He follows the data and not the narrative. And he had a piece in the New York Post this week. Let me read a little bit from it. When it comes to climate change, to invoke one of Al Gore's favorite sayings, the biggest challenge is not what we don't know, but what we know for sure, but isn't so. The two new studies show that the Earth's climate is far more complex than often acknowledged, reminding us of the importance of pragmatic energy and climate policies. One of them, led by researchers at China's Tongji University, finds that after years of ice sheet decline, Antarctica has seen a surprising shift, unquote, a record-breaking accumulation of ice. Dr. Pelkey notes that since 2002, Antarctica has seen a steady decline in the total mass of its glaciers, yet the new study found the decline reversed from 2021 to 2023. A second new paper, a preprint now going through peer review, finds a similar change at the opposite end of the planet. Quote, the loss of Arctic sea ice cover has undergone a pronounced slowdown over the past 2 decades across all months of the year, the paper's US and UK authors write. They suggest that the, quote, pause in Arctic sea ice decline could persist for several more decades. Together, the two studies remind us that the global climate system remains unpredictable, defying simplistic expectations that change moves only in one direction. Pelkey then goes on to note that John Kerry predicted in 2009 that the Arctic would be ice-free in the summer by 2013, and that didn't happen. And Al Gore has made similar predictions that also did not come true. So again, it's so great to have you here. I want to start with you again, Judy, and maybe get your reaction to that. I mean, you've been studying climate as a scientist in academia and outside now for decades. These predictions on sea ice were wrong. In fact, they were unknowable, really, but they were pushed out there to create a panic that now seems difficult to stop, or maybe easier to stop now.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with the Arctic sea ice because that's the one that's gotten the most publicity over time. But there's a lot of natural climate variability involved in what goes on with the Arctic sea ice. And in terms of melting, I mean, it's really the ocean currents and the heat transfer from the ocean that's more effective at causing any melt than any, infrared CO2 driven heating from above. And a lot of this relates to the winds, about how the ice gets packed and moves around from, sub-basin to sub-basin. So there's just a lot of variability tied up with the circulations. And, the timing of cloudiness and, all sorts of things play into how the Arctic sea ice, is varying. But you saw this big drop from about the year 2000 to 2007, a big drop. Okay, and then you had some fluctuations, and then you had a low year in 2012, and then you saw some more fluctuations. But at the end of the day, where we're at right now is the same ice extent that we really saw in 2007. Okay, so we haven't seen any net change in, approaching 20 years. And this
it's a new stable regime, basically, that it's reached.
Exactly. And so, when we see a big shift in the Atlantic circulation patterns, this could actually cause an increase. So natural variability is really the key driver. Yeah, there probably is some slow creep of declining sea ice from global warming, but it's really not in the driver's seat in terms of what we see on timescales of a few decades, which is really driven by natural variability. Now, in the Antarctic, ironically, at McMurdo, there's no, that's one of the few places on the planet where there isn't any climate change. This is in the center of the continent. That's pretty stable climate right there. And overall, the ice mass of Antarctic, which we can now measure with, new satellite systems, it's a delicate balance between accumulation of snowfall and then melting. And we've actually seen, if you recall, in 2023, there was very little Antarctic sea ice, even during the winter. And this was caused by winds coming from the north, strong winds coming from the north that kept the ice very compact and close to the continent. So you had a very low sea ice extent. And they say, oh my gosh, global warming. Well, it wasn't. It just was a particular wind pattern that was actually tied to what was going on in the stratosphere associated with the Hunga Tonga eruption. This was also a year where you had a big Antarctic ozone hole. So there's all sorts of complicated things going on. And ironically, that low sea ice period allowed more evaporation from the ocean close to the continent, and they had a big batch of snowfall on the continent, which increased the ice mass balance. So these are some of the processes that are going on, and trying to blame everything on, CO2 fueled warming, that's just a small piece of what's going on here.
Oh, you're both muted.
Sorry, I had pulled a Jim there. It's what I said was CO2 is a bit player in climate.
Yes,
In
shorter
terms of
version.
scale, regional and decadal scale climate variability, yeah, CO2 is a bit player.
Yeah. All right. Very well analyzed. Thank you very much, Dr. Curry. Let's move on to our third item right here for our news rundown. And I've titled it, funnily, I think, Bernie and the Jets. Now, Socialist Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, who has called climate change the existential threat to humanity and has proposed getting rid of all fossil fuels and banning the internal combustion engine. He was interviewed by Brett Baer on Fox News the other day. Brett asked him about taking private jets on his quote-unquote Fighting the Oligarchy tour, and that hit 17 cities from February through April. And let's just say that Bernie's reaction of being asked about this hypocrisy for the first time didn't go too well for him. Go ahead and play that, please, Andy.
Gotten criticized from other people. Free Beacon says Bernie Sanders spent $221,000 on private jets fighting the oligarchy tour, paid for by friends of Bernie Sanders. That you've spent millions of dollars in campaign funds on private jet travel over the years. How do you push back on both of those things?
When's the last time you saw Donald Trump during a campaign mode at National Airport?
No, it doesn't. But he's also not fighting the oligarchy.
No. You run a campaign and you do 3 or 4 or 5 rallies in a week. The only way you can get around to talk to 30,000 people. Think I'm going to be sitting on a waiting line at United, waiting, 30,000 people are waiting? That's the only way you can get around. No apologies for that. That's what campaign travel is about. We've done it in the past. We're going to do it in the future.
And you...
All right.
Just do not change.
Yeah, I mean, Lene, I do want to start with you. I mean, can you imagine a senator sitting in an airport where all the dirty, smelly people waiting to board a United Airlines flight? No,
he has like
can't do
3
that.
speeches. He has 3 speeches a week. He can't stand in line, unlike, like James Taylor or something, president of the Heartland Institute, who definitely stands in line at the airport to go do 3 speeches in a week, sometimes international. No, it's nonsense. But, it would be one thing if he wasn't running around doing this like oligarchy tour. Like he said, Donald Trump takes a private jet. I don't have any issues with people taking private jets. I do have an issue with people taking private jets while they're telling the rest of us that we shouldn't be driving our cars to and from work. We should be taking public transportation because we're killing the planet with emissions. That's what bothers me.
Yeah, I mean, the carbon footprint, if you care about that, of taking private aviation as opposed to flying commercial is 20 times higher. So, and he doesn't feel the need to apologize for that, I guess.
Yeah. So I think the thing to do to combat this is that we start spreading the rumor that all of the chemtrails in the sky are caused by Bernie.
Anthony, you promised it was going to be a chemtrails-free podcast today, and you just broke your promise.
That was a joke. That was not a discussion.
All right. Let's move on to this next one. This comes from our very own Anthony Watts at our very own Climate Realism website, climaterealism.com. Climate change and school days. Anthony writes a story with the headline, wrongphys.org. Climate change isn't causing a rise in lost school days. Anthony writes here, in a recent editorial published by phys.org, researchers claim that climate change is driving more powerful and frequent hurricanes, which in turn are causing widespread school closures, labeling it an, quote, overlooked consequence of our supposedly worsening climate. This narrative is false. The available data shows no trend of increasing hurricane frequency or intensity due to human-induced climate change. And if the storms themselves aren't worsening, the claim that they are causing more missed school days due to climate change collapses under its own weight. According to NOAA's Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory, there is no strong evidence of an increase in either the number or intensity of hurricanes globally due to human-caused climate change. And if you're wondering how any of this relates to kids missing days of school, Anthony explains, the authors of the phys.org piece make the speculative leap from, quote, climate-driven hurricanes to, quote, missed school days. But if their logic runs off the rails here, there is no credible evidence that links climate change to educational disruptions. And even if storm-related school closures are increasing in some areas, the cause is due to shifts in administrative policy, liability concerns, and enhanced emergency response protocols rather than intense weather. So, Anthony, obviously, you need to go first on this one. There seems to be no end to the long list of calamities, social calamities caused by us driving our SUVs.
Yeah, this is one of the worst cases of a reporter basically having a narrative in their head saying, climate change is making hurricanes worse. That's all the research they did on this before they wrote this piece. They make that assumption. Climate change is worsening hurricanes without actually looking at any data. And then they write from that narrative. And so they make these fantastic leaps of illogic to come up with these things, such as, it's causing more lost school days. But when you go really look at what's been going on with schools over the last 30 years or so, they've been much more cautious about weather. And, back when I grew up, we had to walk both ways uphill in the snow to school, that kind of stuff. They would keep schools open, unless it was a real calamity. And so now even the hint of a hurricane may be hitting Florida or South Carolina or wherever it might be, there's school closures instead of waiting until the actual thing gets here. So the increase in days can be attributed to changes in policy, not climate change, but they never made that connection. And that's really shoddy journalism.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a comment on this one. There is some nuance here.
Okay.
The biggest issue with hurricanes in recent years has been inundation and flooding. Okay, compound flooding from, storm surge, rivers, and heavy rainfall. And the exacerbating factor, well, apart from, land use and building too much stuff in the way of all this, there is an issue since about 2017. There's been a shift in the frequency of Atlantic landfalls more towards September and October and away from August. And this means that these hurricanes then interact with the mid-latitude storm systems and produce more rain, or they can stall like Harvey. So we're seeing more interactions with landfalling hurricanes happening in the fall, interacting with mid-latitude storms and producing more flooding. So flooding is something that you want to, it's not like the wind damage, it's over in 2 hours. So the flooding is something that can fool you. It can happen before landfall and it can persist for a long time. We, of course, saw the huge mess from Hurricane Helene in western North Carolina. So there are complexities here, and there are maybe more school closures. I don't know. It's not something I've looked at related to, maybe a shift in when these hurricanes are happening over the seasonal cycle. But, you can't blame that on CO2. So there is perhaps an issue to look at, but you can't blame it on CO2.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's the whole narrative lately. Everything is caused by CO2, There's been a meme going around on Facebook in the last week where people have this, they say, I was tying my shoes today and my shoelace broke. Obviously, it was caused by climate change. Seriously, that's the kind of mocking they're doing now, because regular people are starting to recognize that the level of fear-mongering that's going on out there has become absurd. And so they're starting to mock it now. And I think that contributes to the decline of interest in the whole climate change thing that's going on right now. That, and of course, the Trump administration is squishing it like a bug wherever they can. But yeah, here it is. This is going around Facebook. It gets a lot of repeats. It gets a lot of reposts. People are laughing at that, and it's a good meme because it basically illustrates that the level of claims are reaching the absurd. They're getting desperate, and so we see more and more absurd claims.
Well, I think some of that you can really see with the what I think seems to be quite a bit of a scam or a racket that's made just for media posts, and that's the attribution, the individual event attribution studies that come out, where they go and they say this storm would have been this percentage less severe had we not been using carbon, had we not been emitting carbon dioxide. And it's, to me, all of those, especially the rapid attribution studies, seem to be just tailor-made for headlines. They come out so fast. There's no way that they could have, especially with hurricanes, that they could have incorporated all the data, because the National Hurricane Center doesn't even consolidate everything and finalize everything until like potentially days to weeks after the hurricane is already over. So yeah, no, it's very irritating.
Yeah, well, didn't I hear news this week that NOAA or some federal agency is ending the collection of the so-called $1 billion storm thing, tracking anymore? I think they started it in 1997. So actually, the reason I thought of it is I saw this morning a tombstone, and it's a $1 billion weather disasters, 1997 to 2025. Rest in peace. So. Yeah, and what do you have any thoughts on that, Judy? The yeah, there it is up on screen. Thanks for that.
Yeah, they failed to take account of various changes. In terms of they tried to make this look like climate change is causing all this. They failed to account for various inflationary and population changes and property development changes and adaptation changes. They didn't scale for any of this. And Roger Pilkey Jr. has called this out as being completely misleading. When you do the appropriate scaling, you don't see a trend. But at the end of the day, if you're trying to show that global warming causes worsening hurricanes, leave the damage data out of it. Just look at the physics of the storms and the data and try not to relate it to damage, because that is just, far too fungible in terms of all the many factors that influence it.
Yeah, the whole thing about billion-dollar disasters has been it reinforces the need for more climate research. It's like, from their perspective, a disaster away keeps the budget hatchet away. And so they just keep trying to put out more and more stuff to make you think it's getting worse or bad or whatever, and we need more money. And so it boils down to empire building within the government. And so that's come toppling down very quickly now. Of course, there's a lot of screaming going on with all of that, but it's justifiable. We do not need to have a government arm of climate propaganda out there pushing out things that are not necessarily true, that are based on, leaps of illogic from, some indications of data to something that's totally irrational. And we've seen a lot of that. And Roger Pilkey Jr. was very right to call this out. And kudos to him for being a spearhead against this nonsense.
Yeah, for sure. It seems climate realism is on the rise. I don't just say that because that's the name of this show, but we're going to talk about something that I think bolsters that argument, and that is our main topic, and that's Judith Curry on the climate apocalypse. You should be visiting her if you're interested in this topic at all. You should be a regular visitor of her blog, Climate, Etc. And she gave a little summary of her paper that was just released this week with a post titled "Critique of the Climate." The apocalyptic climate narrative. Now, Judy, you wrote on your blog that you and economist Harry DeAngelo have a new paper, as I just mentioned, published in the Journal of Applied Corporate Finance. It's titled A Critique of the Apocalyptic Climate Narrative. The paper reflects the journal's ongoing interest in publishing articles that analyze important environmental, social, and governance (ESG) issues in ways that are useful for investors, money managers, and corporate directors, as well as for the economists and legal scholars who study corporate governance. Now, we mentioned ESG, but stay with us here, because I have a feeling this paper, this is a paper that the corporate investor audience that Dr. Curry is targeting, we're not maybe expecting this, but maybe relieved to see. So here, you and Harry DeAngelo write, the apocalyptic climate narrative is a seriously misleading propaganda tool and a socially destructive guide for public policy. Their narrative radically overstates the risks to humanity of continued global warming, which are manageable, not existential. It prescribes large-scale, near-term suppression of fossil fuel use while failing to recognize the huge costs that such suppression would inflict on humans because fossil fuels are currently irreplaceable inputs for producing food via ammonia-based fertilizer, steel, cement, and plastics. This paper details the flaws in the apocalyptic climate narrative, including why the threat from human-caused climate change is not dire, and why urgent suppression of fossil fuel use would be unwise. We argue that sensible public policies would focus instead on developing a diversified portfolio of energy sources to support greater resilience and flexibility to respond to whatever weather and climate extremes that might occur. We identify 9 principles for sensible U.S. public policies toward energy and discuss implications of the flaws in the narrative for investors and their agents. Now, Dr. Curry, I applaud your work and your adherence to science and data and not alarmism. And I imagine the analysis and data and the conclusions of this paper might be quite lonely in the academic literature. I wonder if you can just start us off talking a little bit about this paper and what you found.
Okay. Well, just a little bit of backstory. My day job, is president of Climate Forecast Applications Network. We have a lot of clients in the insurance and the energy sector broadly defined. So, I work with them to help understand and manage their weather and climate related risk. And I've also helped several companies to work through the ESG process. And I'm continually, especially my insurance clients, mostly in insurance-linked securities, their investors are always saying, like the fund managers are saying, this is what we think is going to happen. This is how we should allocate our money. And then the investors say, well, what about global warming? And they have to come up with some sort of an argument to say, if you were just going to invest based strictly on a global warming argument, you're going to lose a lot of money. And I have to help them figure out how to make that case. I was maybe 2 years ago, I was invited to testify before the Senate Banking Committee, Senator Whitehouse's committee on the impact of global warming on the insurance sector. And I wrote, testimony, explaining, where I thought all this was going and what was wrong with it, and with the ESG and investing. And when Harry DeAngelo, he contacted me, some months ago, and had a draft of a paper that he wanted my take on it, and he wanted to publish it in the Journal of the Applied Corporate Finance. He said the editor, wanted him to submit a paper on this, and I didn't like the first draft of the paper because it was a bit of a polemic. And I thought, I was interested in this audience. And so we decided to collaborate. But basically, I, took a lot of the arguments from my book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, and summarized them in terms of, is this really, the climate crisis isn't what it used to be. A lot of these arguments that I made in my book, and we tailored them to this particular audience. Specifically with regards to ESG, companies are struggling, to show some harm to that, to their company or their activities that would be caused by human-caused warming on timescales of maybe 30 years. Because that's, the length that we're looking at. This is a time scale where natural weather and climate variability dominates, and so what are they supposed to say? A heat wave might be, 0.2 of a degree warmer. What kind of an impact is that? So there's very little they can show. And so it's very frustrating for them to try to make up some sort of narrative. And so people use the 8.5 extreme emissions scenarios to try to show an impact. And of course, real policymakers have abandoned the extreme emissions scenario since 2021. It's only the scientists who keep pushing the extreme emissions scenario, not people who energy economists who realize that these are totally implausible scenarios, and policymakers have even abandoned them. So we have this little fiction keeping this whole thing afloat. And then the other irony thing that you're supposed to do, this is part of the governance part of ESG. You're supposed to warn your stockholders of any stranded assets that you might have because of all this. And what they really mean is, petroleum and coal related assets. All of this is going to be defunct and you're going to lose money. And the real irony of this is right now, it looks like the biggest potential stranded assets would be offshore wind turbines. So those are the ones that are looking, and even onshore wind that are looking, in a decade or two. My guess is that a lot of that is going to be stranded. So it's really misguided. Some of the ideas behind ESG, in terms of, environmental responsibility and stuff, they're just fine. And being aware of your vulnerability of your supply chains to extreme weather. I mean, those things are all good. But the real motivation for this is, related to human caused climate change and the drive to get rid of fossil fuels. And so it really torques companies to either waste their time putting together these reports, and to do a real thorough report with the climate impact assessment, can cost upwards of $200K if you hire these firms who have developed a cottage industry and downscaling the models and impact models and stuff like that. Or worse yet, spending that money and wasting all that time is one thing, but worse yet, it can guide your investments in unfortunate directions. Not only can you lose money on things like offshore wind, but there's an opportunity cost. There's better places for your money to go, that is being torqued by this whole ESG game. So these are some of the issues that we try to address. Going through all the science bits, most of this comes out of my book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, if you're familiar with that. So there's, it's really, the climate crisis isn't what it used to be. We're no longer using the extreme emissions scenario. Even the IPCC agrees that the extreme high values of climate sensitivity are unlikely, and so forth and so on. There needs to be more of a realistic, pragmatic approach for companies to try to deal with these issues, make sure they have enough energy. The biggest issue facing a lot of these companies is having enough energy, especially, with the AI and the need for data centers and everybody, adopting this technology. There's a huge explosion in the need for electricity. This is the biggest problem facing these companies, not trying to carbon credits and all this kind of thing. Just trying to give more of a rational basis for companies and investors to try to cope with this issue. And, I think what I'm hearing from the new Secretary of Energy and Secretary of Interior and the EPA is that they're looking for like pragmatic approaches. They're not looking to, just nuke the whole thing, because they realize we can have this windshield wiper thing back and forth between Republican administrations versus Democratic administrations. The way I read it, that they're looking for some sort of pragmatic, sensible compromise to move forward on a rational 20th century energy transition, and reduce our vulnerability to extreme weather and make sure everybody has enough energy. So, I think that's where this is going, and to worry about real pollution rather than, these Biden put in place so many of these stringent anti-pollution things designed to make it impossible for a coal plant to operate. And, putting it at levels that make no sense for human or ecosystem health. So, a lot of nonsensical things have been going on. We just tried to lay out, a rational basis for moving forward in a sensible way on this stuff.
Yeah, one of the most nonsensical things that's been going on with the climate narrative in the past decade or more has been focusing on severe weather equals climate change. And in every situation, it seems like when you actually look at the data, it actually fails. But you have a paragraph in your paper I want to highlight that says, second, the risks from human-caused global warming are difficult to separate credibly from natural weather and climate variability, and the risks to a large degree reflect the vulnerabilities of less developed countries and poorer populations generally. Increasing wealth and productivity will continue to reduce humanity's vulnerability to weather and climate-related risk. And that is so true. I mean, you look at what's happened in the last century in the United States and around the world. As we have become more wealthy, more affluent, more knowledgeable, enabled by fossil fuels, by the way, we have been better at predicting hurricanes, getting people out of the way, predicting tornadoes and getting people out of the way, mitigating against sea level issues, mitigating against all kinds of weather events. And so we're going to get even better at that as the future comes our way. We're going to have better models for predicting weather. We're going to have better systems for the mitigation of the effects. And so what Dr. Curry has basically done here in this one paragraph is basically created a path for the future that's, like you say, pragmatic. And I applaud you for that.
Thanks, Anthony.
It's also pretty funny, when you were talking about the things that Trump is doing to unwind a lot of what Biden had done and previous administrations had done, especially with regards to agencies kind of misusing their power. Like something came across my feed this morning about how the U.S. Geological Survey has been asked to stop focusing, all in on climate change stuff and actually start doing some geological surveys. So that's pretty incredible. I like to hear that. That was very nice.
Yeah.
Everybody's gotten on the bandwagon of trying to save the planet. We must do something, and it's invaded virtually every government organization. And so Trump is right to get these people back on track to their core missions.
Well, I mean, Judy, you've talked about this a lot. I mean, this is where the funding is. And, if you put climate change, you can basically research anything your heart desires as long as you put and the impact on climate change in the proposal. And the federal government has been funding that for decades now. And there's a new sheriff in town, and he's not going to be willing to pay for that sort of stuff anymore. So it seems to me that it might be drying up because that's the incentive for a lot of this, I think.
Well, okay, the funding, they're just not funding like climate scientists like me, but the National Institute of Health. If you want to get a proposal funded by the National Institute of Health, you somehow fit the words climate change in there and you have a much better chance of getting funded. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, completely ridiculous, but that's the game, okay, that people have to play. And I think, as far as I understand it, proposals at NSF and NOAA and federal funding agencies like that are being flagged for certain keywords, not that they're being thrown out, but they're being flagged for extra scrutiny. I certainly hope that fundamental climate dynamics research will continue, but some of this impacts work where people just look at the output of climate models and try to find something scary. It just isn't useful. But, so I'm hoping we can get back to basics in climate research.
That would be good. Yeah. Before we get to Q&A here from our audience, we have quite a few questions already. What kind of reaction has this paper gotten, or what kind of feedback have you gotten from both the the corporate business community and also fellow scientists and researchers?
Okay. Well, Harry sent preprints to a number of people that he knew in the economics and business community, several hundred, responses from the vast majority were very favorable. Maybe 2 of them were, sort of hysterical, but the consensus and, all this kind of thing. And, this is just going to be a disaster if people pay attention to this paper. There were a few reactions like that, but most of them were, oh, well, this is a lot of material that I didn't know. I mean, this puts it into perspective. This makes sense. So I was very gratified by that. And then when it was published, I started tweeting and posted an article on my blog, and this gave the paper more exposure in the atmospheric and environmental and energy space. I think the paper has been downloaded maybe some 3,500 times or something. It's still early days. The paper was just published, so it is getting some readership. And also, I think Anthony cross-posting this on WhatsApp with that also, help the paper downloads and help spread the word. But I'm hoping the article gets some traction because there's a lot of common sense, and I think it resonated with a lot of people. I'll also send a copy of the paper to my clients, in the insurance and energy sector, because they face all these kind of issues too. So I'll see what kind of a response I get from them. I'll probably do that early next week.
All right, and we'll put a link to your blog post on this, and also the paper itself in the description of this video, so people can check it out for themselves.
Great, thank you.
All right, well, let's. We do have a lot of questions for you, Judy, and the rest of the panel here. So why don't we get going with that? One of our favorite parts of this show. So Linnea, take it away. All right, that's still a controversial drop.
Yeah, I made a joke behind the scenes. I'm going to get out my handy dandy notebook with that, with the intro the way it is there. Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to address a couple of kind of funny questions that we have from some of our usual viewers today to start, and that is from Chris, who says, "Isn't Sterling back from Rome yet?" Sterling Burnett, our other panelist on this show, who is in fact the Archbishop of Ranterbury. He is not back from Rome. No, he unfortunately was not able to join us today, but he'll appreciate knowing that people were asking for him. All right, let's see. John Hunter says, "Where's Al Gore these days? Anybody seen him?" Anthony, where is Al Gore?
No idea.
He popped up. I saw him. He popped up somewhere, spouting the same stuff. I said, "Oh, haven't seen Al Gore in a while." And I spotted this within the last few weeks. So he's still out there, still saying the same things. Again, people aren't paying too much attention to him anymore.
Yeah, I think what's happened with a lot of the climate alarmists, Michael Mann did this. He and some of the other ones, they moved from Twitter over to this other platform called Blue Sky, which they basically did that to get away from criticism. And they've got their own little clique going on over there. And I think Gore's over there too. And so what's happened is their visibility has actually gone down because they've moved to this other platform that's not mainstream. And they get to have their own conversations where they're reinforcing each other's egos and ideas and so forth and so on. And man can blather all he wants and not have to worry about critiquing, because all of his acolytes will go, "Ooh, that's wonderful, that's perfect, that's visionary," all that other rubbish that they think, because they don't have critical thinking skills. But I think that's what's happened here with a climate cabal in general. They've isolated themselves now from social media to prevent criticism, and they're getting ignored or just looking like they've disappeared.
Yeah, Michael Mann, he had an announcement on his Twitter that he was leaving Twitter on January 20th when Trump is inaugurated, largely because Michael Mann hates Elon Musk, not to mention hates Donald Trump. So, all his little minions followed him and left. And you're right, now they just have a big echo chamber over there and nobody's paying attention.
Yep.
All right, excellent. Let's see. This is a quick one. I'm not actually sure. I think the answer is yes to this, but Ian McMillan says, "And there are volcanoes under the Antarctic ice sheet, right?"
Yes, for sure. And the number 80 comes to mind, and I'm trying to figure out what part of the West Antarctic ice sheet was actually covered by that. But there's a lot of heat flow, like geothermal heat flux coming up, and there was actually one active volcano. And that the West Antarctic ice sheet it's also it's uplifting. It also has there's a lot of geologic activity in that region. So blaming everything on global warming is just really misguided. A lot of geologic activity.
Awesome. Okay. This is an interesting question. I wonder if Anthony might have an interesting answer, and as well as Dr. Curry. So Chris Nisbet asks, does less sea ice cover actually allow for more heat to escape from the sea? So inherently it's self-regulating.
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer is yes. It's not only about heat, it's also about evaporation and snowfall. Okay. So we saw this in Antarctica, where the sea ice extent was reduced because the wind was just pushing it all towards the continent. But that enabled more water vapor and more snowfall to fall on the continent. So there's both thermal and rainfall kind of feedbacks.
Oh, there's albedo change too.
Albedo change too. So it's lots of interesting processes. It's not just like a one-way causality associated with CO2 increasing.
This is another interesting question from Gilbert Guys, who asks, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on polar shifting and climate effects? And I think what he means is magnetic polar shifting.
Well, there is probably something there, but people aren't paying attention to it. And that sort of surprises me, because if you talk to planetary scientists, talking about, Mars or Saturn or whatever, the magnetic field is really a big part of how they understand and explain the atmosphere of those planets. And I asked the planetary scientists, well, why don't you do magnetic field modeling for the Earth? Oh, that's way too complicated, so we don't do it. Whoa, okay, that was sort of a signal that there's probably something there, but people aren't looking at it. That's one of those known unknowns that people really should pay attention to. I don't know what kind of effect. I would be very surprised if it had no effect.
Yeah, but whether it's a large effect is the question.
I don't know. Yeah, it could.
Yeah.
It could. I don't know.
That's the honest answer that a lot of scientists won't do. They don't want to say, we don't know, because they want to appear like they know everything, or they're, on top of their game or whatever. But the honest answer that you just gave is refreshing, and we need more of that.
Absolutely.
Well, if you don't know, you can't impose the policy preferences that you want to impose.
Exactly.
That, and I think that, lay people really hate hearing I don't know from scientists a lot of the time. So I think, and especially government people, right? So I think there's also probably a lot of pressure on scientists to manufacture an answer. They shouldn't be doing that, but I think there's a lot of pressure to do it. So Nothing As It Seems says, ask Judith about the Heinrich event that was at the end of the Younger Dryas.
Okay, well, Heinrich, this is like huge fluctuations in global temperature, like after the end of the previous ice age, and people still don't quite understand what caused them. I think it was, feedbacks, from the sea ice and changing mass balance of glaciers, ocean circulation patterns, and all these interactions. So it was, a lot of big changes went on during the period that we don't have convincing, simple explanations, but it was almost certainly associated with thermodynamic feedbacks associated with ice sheets and also large-scale ocean circulations. Natural climate variability, in other words.
Absolutely. Okay, we have, this is a good question from Gustavo. Oh, I'm sorry, Gustavo. Your name is going to kill me here, but I think he's from Portugal. And he says, One claim made by alarmists that is the core issue is not unprecedented warming, but rather the rate of warming, which prevents ecosystems from adapting. How true is this?
Okay. Whether or not the rate of warming that we're seeing is unusual is something we don't know, largely because, the geologic, you look at the hockey stick and all those even longer records going back 10,000 years ago, the time resolution is like 300 to 500 years. So to identify a 50-year spike of warming, you just simply can't resolve it in those data sets. So almost certainly this is not unprecedented rate of warming, but we're unable to document this because our paleoclimate proxies don't have a small enough time resolution for us to resolve this.
Awesome. Great questions today, you guys. Thank you. Let's see. Diane, I see Diane Selby has 2 questions about hurricane season this year. I'm going to save that in case we have time, Diane. We're definitely going to have a hurricane season starter episode once we get a lot of that information, and we'll have hurricane experts on again, like Stan or someone. So we will.
This is a big part of what I do is seasonal hurricane forecasting. So if you want to ask me, I'm good.
Oh, sure. Okay, so we can ask it.
Oh, good.
Okay, so Diane Selby asks, what's the hurricane predictions for 2025, and how was hurricane prediction for 2024? How accurate was it?
Okay, I'll start with 2024 first. Most forecast providers were predicting a crazy active season. There was record Atlantic temperatures, and they expected a La Nina to occur. The main metric that people look at for seasonal forecast is the accumulated cyclone energy. Okay, so average since 1995 is about 135. The average forecast, ACE forecast last year was 215, which with some as high as 240. Okay, the end of season ACE accumulation was 168. My company nailed it last year. Our forecast starting December, the season before, ranged from 161 to 171. So as far as I know, my company's the only one that nailed it. For this season, we're also looking at another active season. Most of the forecasts are coming in around 150 for ACE, which is still above average activity even for this active period since 1995. My company is a little higher than average at around 170. In terms of landfalls, again, we're looking at higher than average landfalls in the US, and we're looking at them focused on Florida and the Gulf Coast rather than the Atlantic coast. So that's what I see right now. There will be a new batch of seasonal forecasts coming out in early June. So if you time your hurricane episode to be, after mid-June, I think you'd have a good representative sample of forecast to talk about.
Awesome. Well, there you go, Diane. Thank you so much. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to get another one that's directed directly at Dr. Curry. So this is from David Schneer, who says, question for Judy. Are the new PhDs in climate taking more rational positions than the hardcore of my generation?
No, it's getting worse. The current cohort, okay, with all this, what I would say DEI stuff in the universe, I was talking to a faculty member at one of the premier, at the AMS meeting, at one of the premier, departments for atmospheric science research. And the faculty member said, we can't flunk, we have to pass everybody through the PhD qualifying exam, otherwise there'll be a lawsuit or something. So we pass all these students in that are, some of which are marginally qualified. And then they all want to do a thesis where they analyze the output of climate models to try to find some scary impact so they can do a press release and, get a lot of publications and get a job at some, NGO think tank that pays a big salary. So, that's what I see coming down the pike. That there's a few university departments that have kept true, to studying climate dynamics and really having a very rigorous program, but they're the exception rather than the rule. So I don't see in the current cohort that are PhD students, I think it's going to be the worst cohort yet.
Do you think it's possible, Judy, that the wins on that will kind of change even within that group if there ends up being some kind of pushback in their industry towards, against kind of alarmism and against the overuse of models?
Because the people the cohort who are attracted to get these degrees, that they want to save the world, they're environmental crusaders. They're not fundamentally physicists who want to understand, the climate system. So we've had the wrong personality type applying into these programs, and the universities have capitulated and, keeping them happy so they can keep the mill turning. So I think we just need a new cohort. Okay, well, once the funding dries up for a lot of this kind of what I would call applied climate research, and there's modest grants to support climate dynamics research, then we'll get back to the tradition of attracting physics-based students, into the field to do a serious PhD. So it's going to take a while.
And I have another related question up on screen here from Over Under Above, who says, do you think pragmatism and realism will ever prevail? And in terms of forecasting, if it does, how long do you think it's going to take?
Well, I think we've seen a seismic change, with the Trump administration. I mean, we now realize how much of all this alarmism was just pure politics. People don't really care when when the politics change, they just move on to something else. It's not like they're, all of the Just Stop Oil and all these people, they've just moved on. Greta Thunberg has moved on. All of these people have moved on because it's no longer the political issue du jour. I mean, the wind have gone from the sails of this issue. So, I think, it's going to take a little bit. I think there's a sensible approach, with the Trump administration and the EPA, Department of Energy, and Department of Interior, who are going to tackle this issue in a sensible way, from what I understand. So, I think that's a good thing. If the tables turn in the next election and Democrats are back in power, will they then embrace climate change like Joe Biden did? I suspect they won't. I suspect there'll be other issues that they think are more important. So, this may be a change point.
They have a tendency to move on very quickly when something becomes unpopular.
Right. Yeah. Well, again, if the funding dries up, then that ends it. I mean, there are a lot of very deep-pocketed, not a lot, but there are some deep-pocketed so-called progressive organizations out there
oligarchs
funding oligarchs, you could use that word, that's right, funding journalism that peddles only alarmism, and we'll see how long that continues.
Yeah.
From Kite Man Music, we have, what was the CO2 level during the 1970s Ice Age prediction?
I'm trying to remember. I think it was about 330.
I'm looking it up right now.
Yeah, 330 is what I'm thinking.
We will have it
All
for
right.
you guys.
Ask Grok.
Yeah.
Grok, is this true?
Grok, is this true?
In 1975, it was about 330 parts per million.
Wow.
Right on it, Judy. Well done.
Now, is that a good thing that you were able to pull that right out of your mind, Dr. Curry, or is it because you've been looking at it for too long?
My PhD thesis, during the 70s, and I remember, the standard was 310 that everyone was using. I said, because I had a radiative transfer, I said, CO2 is increasing. I better update that value. and then I updated it to 330. And again, it was less than a 10% difference, so it wasn't huge. But I remember, that's why I remember that number. I mean, that's a very long time to remember anything. But
this is a really good question from David Cunningham, who says, for Dr. Curry, what research should be funded at present, and what are important questions to attack?
Okay, the key topics to attack are sun-climate connections, including solar indirect effects. There's not enough attention paid to that. General issues related to natural climate variability, both in the oceans, ice sheets, and geologic type processes. We need more funding of that. We need to better understand how natural climate variability influences extreme weather events. So we get like certain regimes of activity and quiet periods, and better understand that so we know how to predict things, 10, 30 years down the road. So investors, insurance companies, whatever, can make decisions about infrastructure. There's still a huge amount of research that needs to be done on clouds, all the different scales of motion. We still don't have that figured out in a way that we can appropriately include clouds in climate predictions. We need to just basic climate dynamics issues, broadly defined. We've lost a whole generation of climate dynamicists because everyone just looks at the output of climate models. They don't think about the processes anymore. How the oceans transport heat and carbon and digest carbon is a big one. A lot of uncertainties in the carbon cycle, both in the land portion of the carbon cycle and the ocean part of the carbon cycle. We can throw magnetic effects out there. I mean, somebody should be looking at that. So there's a whole host of things that we don't sufficiently understand. And we've stopped investigating these issues, not completely, but it's just so much easier to analyze the output of climate models and try to write a quick and easy paper and get a headline.
Absolutely. Well, we've gone past the 1 hour mark, but Dr. Curry, if you're willing to answer a few more questions.
Okay. Yep.
Okay, awesome. Great. We've got a whole lot of questions. I'm trying to pick ones that we haven't frequently covered before, or ones that are very specific to your work. Here's one that's kind of a little bit of a fluff question, but I think it's good. This is from Tech, and he says, has anyone approached Dr. Curry about turning climate uncertainty and risk into a documentary or a movie?
Well, no. I mean, I've done, several hundred podcasts on the book and many interviews and stuff like that. I don't think it's really a philosophy of science book in many ways, so I don't think it lends itself into a movie. But yeah,
I'm almost afraid to say this, but people in the chat can leave who they would like to have play Dr. Curry in the film version of her book.
Yeah, we had this discussion a while ago. I think we came up with Jodie Foster.
Yeah.
Jodie Foster.
Perfect. All right.
Just like in the movie Contact,
Yeah. Okay, Chris Nisbet asks, what is the primary problem with rapid attribution studies that the mainstream media doesn't seem interested in asking about?
Good question. I mean, I was just writing a chapter for something on this topic this past week. First off, people don't look far enough back in the data, in the historical data. Half the time, they don't even look before 1950. There are plenty of extreme events occurring early, in the first half of the 20th century and in the 19th century. And then there's longer historical records. And then if you look at the paleoclimate records, some of them, sedimentary analyses that are local, you can find a lot of extreme events, much worse than anything we're looking at. So most extreme events fail the detection test to identify anything that's unusual. Okay, but even if you go ahead and you try to do an attribution like the World Weather Attribution Group in the UK and Europe, I mean, they crank these things out, within a week of the event. They run regional climate models with current levels of CO2 and pre-industrial levels of CO2 and compare that and then try to make up something related. And they, say it's a 1 in 1,000 year event. It's, 350 times more likely, and all these statistics that make absolutely no sense. They do not have a data distribution that can support those kind of conclusions. The climate models are not fit for purpose for simulating most of these extreme events. So it's mostly just fairly meaningless stuff.
They're basically nothing more than headline generators. That's all they do.
That's their objective. That's their objective.
Capture the headlines.
That's their objective, to try to, amp up the alarm so people will stop burning fossil fuels and to get the headlines. I mean, that's their stated purpose. The World Weather Attribution, you can find those kind of statements right on their webpage.
Here's a good one from Ian, who says, anthropogenic so water emissions are also significant, and water is a far more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So why do they claim that carbon dioxide is a driver, but water is merely a feedback?
Well, it depends on how you define your system. So if you define a climate model without a carbon cycle, okay, then CO2 is an external forcing agent, whereas CO2 can evaporate and rain out and, fall back down. So that's a feedback. But in the Earth system models now, where they actually have an interactive carbon cycle, CO2 is actually a feedback also in those models. So, it depends on how you define the system.
All right. So
these are good questions.
They're really good questions. You guys are on it today, all of our wonderful viewers. How about this one from a viewer I have not seen before, Kroiki? Is Antarctica land ice net gaining, or is this unknown?
Well, we just had the paper that we talked about where it was increasing for a while, then decreasing. Now it's turned the corner to increasing. And this is the East Antarctica, the main continent. The West Antarctic ice sheet is the unstable one, the one that's a marine ice sheet. Like if you took the ice sheet away, the actual part of the continent would be way below sea level. So this is an unstable. And this is unstable because it's a marine ice sheet. It's unstable from geothermal heat flux and even under ice volcanoes, and it's being possibly destabilized to some extent from CO2-driven warming. So the bulk of the ice is in the East Antarctic, and that's very stable, whereas the West Antarctic is the unstable one.
Let's see. This one's kind of a general question, but I think it's one that we might want to talk about for a second, from Walter, who says, wonder if anyone has calculated how much money has been spent on green energy in the last 40 years in taxpayer subsidies and higher energy costs. I think he means energy. Imagine if that had been spent on nuclear.
Oh, yeah. No, I think people have done these calculations. I can't cite them off the top of my head, but no, we took the wrong path. We should have been investing in nuclear all along. But, Greenpeace and some of these other environmental groups, I think they actually hate nuclear worse than they hate fossil fuels. They still hate nuclear. But I think the international politics are turning in favor of nuclear now, and hopefully we'll see a rapid expansion. And I think Doug Burgum, Department of Interior, is trying to figure out how to make the permitting and all this kind of stuff far more efficient and quick so that we can build nuclear power plants in 6 years, not 16 years.
Yep. Here's a good one from our longtime viewer, Bob Johnson, who asks, "Are the oceans boiling?"
Well, not if you've dipped your toe in it lately. Actually, the oceans since last year have cooled off quite a bit. I mean, it's pretty striking since from what
Yes,
they
but
were
the
a year ago.
rhetoric has heated up.
All right. Let's see. Here's an interesting question from Tech, who says, "Can Dr. Curry compare the quality of code from her time in academia versus her time in private industry?"
Okay. Code, well, I mean, my time in academia, okay. Software packages are much better now. Like we used to have to code a lot of things by hand. Now we use MATLAB, there's all these packages, including AI packages, that you have very robust code that you can apply and integrate into your specific code. So I think coding is better. AI is coding. I mean, we've played around a little bit with that to, pose a problem to AI and have it code. And AI is pretty powerful at coding. So I think overall coding is better than when it was way back when. I mean, debugging a program and, I mean, I started, in the bad old days, decks of computer cards and, two boxes. My program was 2 boxes of cards. And you would feed it into a card reader and you'd wait overnight for the results. And then you'd have one little problem and, oh, shoot, have to fix that card and then start the process all over again. And so it was a massively slow process in the old days. And the computers, the mainframe computers that I was using back then, your cell phone's an order of magnitude more powerful. So, computing is in a much better place now than it was back in the old days.
Yeah, I was in that era, learned on the era of punch cards and paper tape and teletype machines and deck writers and all that stuff. Yeah, we've come a long way from that.
All righty. Just a couple more here, and then we'll have to get going. Let's go. Boxwood Green, who I'm not sure I've seen in the chat before, says, "Did the CO2 level not drop to 70 or 80 at the end of the last ice age, just barely over the total death zone for plants?" I think the death zone is quite a bit higher, is a little bit higher than that.
It was
it did not drop to 70 or 80. That's wrong.
No, it was about maybe 180 at its lowest in the interglacials. And the dust zone for plants is still below that, but it's getting close. At 180 is not a good place to be.
Yep, absolutely. Oh, you know what? Let's go. This is a good question, both for Anthony and Dr. Curry, which is, do we have 30 good years of data to base future predictions on?
I want to say no in terms of the temperature record. The surface temperature record is, as you know, badly corrupted, badly managed, and it's inflated. When I did my surface station study, and I found, that over 90% of the stations had been encroached upon, and the remaining few percent, when we went and examined the data from them versus the stations that had been encroached upon versus the entire data set, we see a rate of warming in the past 30 years of about half. So in terms of the surface temperature data, I don't think we do have good data, but we might have some other good data for some other data sets that Dr. Curry could talk about, I'm sure.
No, the surface temperature data is much better than most data. But in terms of making predictions, we use these on model, we use global climate models that don't directly use the data. I mean, that they're spun up for a few decades and then they equilibrate to the current climate and then they're forced with whatever climate change. So they don't directly rely on climate data. But, the state of the data is very frustrating. Satellite data sets give you good coverage. So they're important, but at the end of the day, satellites are measuring voltages in order to get, real geophysical things like temperature or humidity or ice mass balance, there's a whole lot of manipulations that are needed. So, and then if you look at the paleoclimate data, that's even worse. So that's, you know, so the data just isn't good enough, but we do what we can and try to piece things together.
Thank you very much. All right. Well, I think unfortunately we probably have to get going. I think Anthony has to go. We have a lot of questions still, but unfortunately, you guys, we are just not going to be able to get to them. I'm going to hand it off to Jim Lakely. Thank you, guys.
And thank you guys. This has been a fantastic show. I want to thank our guest, Dr. Judith Curry. You can check her out at Climate Etc., but actually it's easy just to put her name in there, judithcurry.com. And be sure to check out her latest book. I want to implore people to visit some of these great websites from the Heartland Institute, climaterealism.com, climateataglance.com. What's up with that? And of course, always go to heartland.org where you can subscribe to our Climate Change Weekly newsletter. And I want to thank all of you in the audience. The live chat today was very, very lively, fantastic questions. And I hope to have Dr. Curry back on this program again in the future. Thank you all for watching, and we will talk to you next week. Bye-bye.
How dare you!